At the start of the 20th century, England and Wales saw a surprising trend in its prison system. While crime was on the rise, the number of inmates was steadily falling. In 1905, the prison population stood at 21,525, but over the next 10 years, that number was almost cut in half, dropping to just over 11,000. By 1918, it had reached a record low for the century, 9,199 inmates. Remarkably, these lower levels were maintained through the 1920s and 1930s. In 1940, the number stood at just 9,377. The man largely credited with laying the groundwork for this significant shift was Herbert Gladstone, the son of former Prime Minister William Gladstone. Herbert had worked closely with his father before entering politics himself. When he became Under-Secretary of State at the Home Office during his father's final government in 1892, public criticism of harsh prison conditions, particularly from Irish MPs and the media, prompted the Liberal government to commission a review. Gladstone led the resulting 1895 inquiry, which became known as the Gladstone Report. Although the Liberals lost power just 2 months after the report's release, its influence was profound. It established rehabilitation as a key goal of imprisonment, alongside deterrence. When the Liberals returned to government a decade later, they put many of its recommendations into action. Between 1905 and 1915, under Gladstone and his successors, Winston Churchill and Reginald McKenna, the government introduced several progressive sentencing policies designed to reduce the prison population. In 1907, a probation system was established to provide support and guidance as an alternative to incarceration. Borstals were introduced for offenders aged 16 to 21, and special courts for children were set up. Perhaps most significantly, magistrates were required to allow fines to be paid in installments, which prevented many people from being jailed simply because they couldn't afford immediate payment. This alone led to a dramatic drop in short-term imprisonments, reducing the number of people sent to prison each year from around 200,000 in 1903 to just 30,000 by 1918. What's even more striking is how this low level of incarceration persisted through the next 2 decades, despite major social upheavals. The 1920s brought the 1926 general strike and mass unemployment. At the same time, motor vehicle ownership exploded, from under 200,000 cars to over 1 million by the end of the decade, doubling again in the 1930s. These changes contributed to rising crime. While crime had grown slowly in the early 1900s and even declined slightly during the 1910s, it surged after 1920, up 46% in the 1920s and doubling again in the 1930s. One would expect prison numbers to rise accordingly, but they didn't. So why didn't the prison population follow the crime rate? There are several reasons. First, World War I had a deep impact on societal views, especially toward young men, who typically make up the bulk of prisoners. Having served in the war, their behavior was often viewed with more leniency. Second, the imprisonment of middle-class activists like suffragettes and conscientious objectors drew sharp attention to prison conditions. Their accounts were harder to dismiss than those of working-class prisoners. One such account, Prisons and Prisoners, 1914, written by Lady Constance Lytton, detailed her experience of being force-fed during hunger strikes. It shocked the public and challenged common attitudes toward the penal system. In 1922, the publication of English Prisons Today by Stephen Hobhouse and Fenner Brockway had even greater impact. Both men had been jailed for opposing the war and included first-hand accounts from prisoners, especially letters smuggled out from Dartmoor. These painted prison as a place that crushed humanity, fueled resentment, and broke spirits. Some prisoners warned their families they would come home like a beast, uncouth and uncivilized, while others promised to return without mercy or compassion. This report became essential reading for penal reformers. According to Marjorie Fry of the Howard League, it served as the Bible of the movement for decades to come. Much of the reform-minded ethos in the prison system during this era can be attributed to Alexander Patterson, a key contributor to English Prisons Today. He became a prison commissioner in 1922 and quickly rose in influence. Patterson took a hands-on approach, even personally interviewing every potential prison staff member. His connections with the media and politicians helped resist public pressure for harsher penalties, even after major incidents like the 1932 Dartmoor prison mutiny. Economic constraints also played a role. With the government's commitment to the gold standard in the 1920s came deep cuts to public spending. A government committee, the Geddes Committee, recommended sweeping austerity measures. As a result, there was little money to build more prisons. In fact, keeping incarceration low was a cost-saving strategy, as several facilities were closed. However, this period of relative penal moderation didn't last. By 1950, the prison population had doubled to over 20,000, and from there the numbers only continued to climb. The real acceleration came after 1993, driven by a shift in political tone and policy. Governments began emphasizing tough-on-crime rhetoric, imposed longer sentences, tightened parole eligibility, and frequently recalled released prisoners. Delays in court proceedings also led to more people being held in custody before trial. Today's prison crisis in the UK can be traced back to these decisions. The sharp contrast between early 20th century restraint and late 20th century expansion shows that prison populations are shaped not just by crime rates, but by political will and public attitudes.